Hello again, everyone. In this video, we'll focus on the delayed exchange variation. Now, this one is unlikely to appear very much in your games, as if people play the exchange, they normally just play it immediately. But it became topical a few years ago in GM games, but Black found a good antidote and it's dropped off again. We'll also have a quick look at White's other moves on move 8 and discover that actually we've got a threat. So we start with the normal moves by this point. And d5 is obviously by far the main move, and d takes e5 is the delayed exchange. If people play the exchange, they're more likely to play it at this point. But there's an argument that the knight could be slightly misplaced on c6 in the exchange structure. We don't have the control over the d5 square that we would normally because the knight is on c6, but we'll quickly rectify that. But yeah, we do actually have a threat. For example, if White plays bishop g5, which has been played a bit over 100 times in the online database, but it just loses the pawn to knight takes d4. E takes is possible too, but this is a more precise move order so that White can't annoy us with some knight d5 here because c6 and we kick the knight away immediately. Whereas if there was a knight on c6, this would be a bit annoying. The point is after queen takes d4, we've got this knight takes e4 double hit. They're sometimes seen in the dragon as well. We collect a pawn and put everything on pre. Our queen is hanging, but the bishop is hanging too, and White's queen is hanging. And after White has a few different ways to try, but he's losing material. For example, queen takes e4, queen takes g5 is just very good. We've got the bishop pair as well as the extra pawn. Queen takes g7, followed by taking on d8. We take on c3. Here we're attacking the bishop on e2, so White has to recapture. And once again, we're a pawn up, and we've got the better structure with a fantastic ending. So the best try is bishop takes d8. We recapture the queen too. White temporarily regains material, but he's got two very weak pawns on the c file. Next we'll go rook c8, and this bishop is misplaced on c7. He's not going to be able to hold on to these c pawns for long, and it's another very bad endgame. So bishop g5 fails. h3 is even worse. We can do the same tactic with swap and take on e4. We're attacking this knight twice, so we've just collected a pawn, and with everything swapped. Here, White should probably just take the knight on d1, but he's a pawn down with a bad position. Knight to b7, knight to b2 is pretty terrible because we're threatening to collect another pawn with knight takes c4 with a discovered attack on the rook, or knight a4 to c3 with an unpleasant fork. So that rook that will have to shift over to b1 with bishop on g7 and the bishop on e2. This is just very bad. And taking on f7 allows bishop takes b2, which is a nice way to recapture. And White is already close to lost here. Just everything is hanging, he's a pawn down. So it's useful to know that we are actually threatening to take on d4 and take on e4 in this position. So White should react. This is a big advantage putting the knight on c6 over the knight bd7 lines we saw at the start of the course, where we didn't actually have a direct threat. We had to prepare, put more pressure on the e4 pawn. This way, White does need to deal with it somehow. So d takes e5 is probably the driest way to do it. de. And bishop g5 is the main move that White tries here. Magnus wants exchange queens in a blitz game. But here, I think we should take back with the knight. It's the most consistent. And I think White has to be very careful here not just to drift into a bad position. I've discussed this kind of structure before. We have the d4 outpost, and White doesn't have a corresponding outpost on d5 because we can play c6. In general, I like the plan of playing bishop g4, take on f3 in most of these positions. Try and leave White with his light square bishop, which isn't able to compete for the d4 square at all, and it's just a bad piece blocked in by his pawns on e4 and c4. And we can just slowly take control of the dark squares. if bishop g5 is an autopilot kind of move, but knight e6, our bishop on g7 is so much better than the one on e2 because we've got a lot more potential for it. If it comes back to d8, we can play c6 and bishop b6. So this bishop isn't just stuck behind its own pawns forever. Quite often, weaker players would try something like this, misguidedly thinking that the more exchanges they get, the closer they are to a draw. But this kind of position is really horrible for white. We're going to play c6, kicking that knight away. It might look pretty for now, but it's only on d5 for one square. And our knight on e6 is a wonderful piece with f4, d4, and c5, all nice spots for it. And we can just grind white forever here. It's going to be incredibly miserable. h3 is played against that plan I mentioned of playing bishop g4 to get rid of the knight. So I recommend developing the bishop a different way with b6. I will put pressure on this pawn on e4. The pawn on e5 is almost never hanging. We can sometimes play rook e8 simply, followed by knight takes e4. But the immediate knight takes e4 works most of the time. The exchange of e-pawns is going to favor us because our bishop is suddenly very strong on the long diagonal with the absence of e5 and e4 pawns. And there's not going to be any knight takes g6 or knight takes f7 trick because knight takes c3 threatens to take the bishop on e2 with check. So all white's pieces start dropping. So it's worth just double checking, but knight takes e5 is almost never actually a move. Bishop e3 would be a more logical move, but we can carry out our plan. Bishop g4, develop our knight. White forces the exchange. And here I like to carry out more of our plan of winning the dark square battle with h5. And one interesting idea here is just play king h7 and bishop h6. Exchange off these dark square bishops and win absolute control of the d4 square. Once again, white's position is actually going to be pretty miserable here. So exchanging queens isn't anything to worry about. We've got this good long-term strategic advantage with the d4 outpost. So white could try bishop e3 as well, but once again we carry out our plan with bishop g4, take off that knight, and jump our knight in. Now the only way to annoy us is to play knight b5 to try and force our knight away. And c5 is interesting here. Our knight's already on a nice square, so we could just cement it. But this does give away the d5 square. So in principle, I'd prefer to avoid it and just drop back. We'll soon be able to go back to the d4 square. The knight's not going to last on b5 for long. And white always has this problem piece, the bishop on f3. h3 would prevent bishop g4, but we can hop in immediately with knight d4. Once again, the pawn isn't hanging because we can just take on e4, take the knight next. And our bishop is active, our knight is active, and we're just already better. So bishop e3 threatens to take on d4 or on e5 when our knight would be hanging on d4. So we'll drop back to defend the e5 and d4 pawns, and we'll follow up with c6, taking control of the d5 square, and bishop e6 and develop our pieces. Once again, we can be happy with such a big knight on d4. You can see that white needs to be quite accurate, not to just drift into a bad position here, because he has got the worst structure after all. So bishop g5 tends to be white's approach, trying to make something of this pin. And we'll carry out our plan. Bishop g4, get rid of the knight, and knight in on d4. And now white normally exchanges queens to try and exploit the pins he's got. The natural jump with knight d5 isn't really getting anywhere. We can just do our normal stuff, exchange the bishop and a nice square for the knight. Next, we'll get rid of this knight on d5 with c6 and be left with this wonderful good knight versus bad bishop scenario. So take, and here we need to be careful. We should take back with the knight so that we aren't in an unpleasant pin with this bishop on g5 down to d8. We take with the rook now, knight d5, and compared to the position with the queen's on, white threatening to take on f6 because our queen's not defending it. So this pin is annoying. So make sure not to allow that pin. Luckily, knight takes is a good substitute move. We're ready to play knight e6. and we'll gain time on the bishop, and the knight is on its perfect square, as hopefully you'll remember from earlier in the video when we were looking at these structures, particularly in the knight d7 line, where the knight was hopping via c5 to e6, or f8 to e6, or even h5 to f4 to e6. Generally, you always wanted that knight on the e6 square. Now, the critical way for white to go is to go pawn grabbing by taking. Otherwise, we're just going to have time to play our knight e6 move. And here, this is white's whole strategy. Our bishop is attacked on f6 and the pawn on c7. So white's winning a pawn. But luckily, we get sufficient compensation for it thanks to our dark square control. Now, take on f3 immediately is a tricky move order, and I think it's the one I'd recommend. It's possible to start with king g7 2, defending the bishop, take rook c8, but now it's important to take on f3. When g takes would transpose, or white could be exceedingly dry with bishop takes, when we'll play rook takes c4 with a level endgame. If we take on f3 now, at least, we have a bit more flexibility. Once again, white chooses. He has to take with a pawn if he wants to maintain his extra pawn. Knight takes f6 check. It needs checking, of course, but king g7, and the knight's not going anywhere. Bishop's hanging on e2, so he'll have to take on f3 anyway. We take on f6, and we've got our good knight versus bad bishop scenario. Knight's ready to hop into d4. So the bishop should be taken on f3. So if white takes with the bishop, we can be a bit more active here and play bishop g5. This is why I suggest that we take on f3 immediately. And after take on c7, rook c8, now if the knight goes back to d5, rook takes c4, I've got a better version because our bishop is active on g5, controlling the c1 square. It's quite important, so that white can't just play rook c1 and trade off more pieces. And with a better bishop, and our knight is also coming into d4, so equal knight, but more active rook, we've got whatever advantage is going here. It's not huge, but definitely something. White hasn't forced a draw yet. Instead, white should probably go pawn grabbing still with knight b5 and take on a7. But now he's got to be very accurate because this knight is obviously misplaced on a7. So it's to be very sure it doesn't get trapped. For example, rook b4, the double attack of hitting the pawn on b2 and preparing rook a8, trapping the knight, is probably our main threat. So the knight pops back, and then we'll take on b2, and the game should be drawn, but if anyone's better, it's us, because we've once again got the better bishop. But the advantage is very slight. So g takes should be played. Then we'll defend this bishop. It might look strange not to play bishop g5 here, but we're about to open the long diagonal. So this is why we play king g7 this time. So white has succeeded in grabbing his pawn and has a good-looking knight. But it's been proven that actually he's not better here at all. Our knight is ready to hop into d4, hitting the bishop, when the bishop will be overworked. If it goes back to d1, we can take on c4. If it goes to d3, we can take on f3. So that is one plan. The other is simply to put the knight on f4, forcing the knights off the board when the opposite color bishop endgame is very drawish here. White has an extra pawn, but actually he's the one who has to be a bit careful, because often we can get some initiative going with white's somewhat vulnerable king and weak kingside pawns. So this isn't a position that white can play risk-free for two results. He has to be very careful. Now white normally plays king g2 to defend the pawn on f3. The other way would be rook c1 to defend the pawn on c4. And after knight d4, king f1. But now we can start getting very active. Bishop g5, f5. The queens may be exchanged, but still the presence of opposite colored bishops means that whoever gets the initiative has very good chances. We can attack on the dark squares, and this bishop on e2 is powerless to defend. So we actually have an extra attacker in all opposite color bishop positions. So the drawish nature is there in pure opposite color bishops, but you shouldn't forget that the initiative becomes very, very important. For example, rook d1, exchange. We've undoubled white's structure, but he was threatening to play f4 here, forcing our knight to lose its outpost. So we want to keep the strong knight. And now we're ready to play rook f8. And white's a pawn up, but the initiative is a very good compensation. I urge you to check out the model game by against Salim in the model games chapter to see how black actually converted the full point here. Certainly not a risk-free position for white. But that's the more ambitious try, rook c1. King g2 does defend, but now we can play knight f4 check and force these knights off the board because the bishop is hanging on e2. There is rook d8 is a tricky move if you want to try it. The threat is to take on d5 and then knight f4, forking king and bishop. So we've got one more threat. Unfortunately, if white finds rook d1, then there's nothing better than playing knight f4 check anyway. But you can start with rook d8 if you want to set one more puzzle for your opponent, one more test. But the check immediately is also fine. Now our compensation is a much better bishop. The one on e2 remains passive, and we've got a nice open line for our bishop. And white does need to be a bit careful. He's got an extra pawn, but we've got a few plans where we can go after the white king too. It should be a draw though. Rook 1. Now you can take the pawn on b2, but white will regain with rook b1, take on b7. So let's just compete for the open file. Now I think the main move to check is rook d5, which we can actually take. When these pawns look scary, but it's important to check that we can stop them on light squares. So with b6, bishop e7, white's never going to be able to get in c5. Bishop on e2 isn't involved. And if you can't get in c5, then the pawns are stuck there on c4 and d5. And the position is simply a draw. This was Erwin Lamy against Timur Radjabov. Our next move is going to be king g7, king f6 to e5 and just run our king into the game. Once again, we've got more active pieces. White's extra pawn shouldn't be felt, but it's unlikely we'll be able to get anything either. And it should just be a draw. But white has had to find some long, accurate sequence here. It's not just exchanging pieces to make the draw, at least. And when we're black, unfortunately, we have to allow some drawish lines somewhere. In the King's Indian, at least, there are very few of them. Or rook b1, and we exchange, take off this pawn. White regains the pawn, and this is Ryantsev against Grishuk. White is still pawn up, but white is one who's got to be a bit careful. We've got an idea of playing rook c5 and then either going after this pawn on a2, but a5, or rook g5 check and rook h5, going after the kingside pawns. So once again, it should be a draw. But white can't play on and hope for more without taking some risk. I'm afraid this isn't the most exciting chapter in the video series. Unfortunately, the delayed exchange is probably one of the most tedious lines. But the good news is it's exceedingly rare outside GMs who are happy to have a day off and just play something exceedingly drawish. White still needs to come up with some good moves. If he's just trying to exchange pieces, he's worse strategically. So he needs this very forcing line of bishop g5, taking on d8, take on f6 with the fork, and then navigating the tricks around there to get into this drawn ending. So I don't really understand why white would choose it. So he's got to be careful to make a draw, but we can't second guess our opponent sometimes. Still, theoretically, we have no problems. Thanks a lot for tuning in. See you again soon. Bye.